Thank you very much for having me, and I guess thank you very much for organizing this wonderful seminar series. Let me just quickly share my screen here. So, you know, as Andre said, this is joint work with Matt Dennis and John Hackney from Carnegie Mellon and South Carolina, respectively. If you're wondering what brought us together, they're both former PhD students at the University of Washington, where I actually was a faculty member up until a couple months ago. So this is a paper that you know tries to ask a relatively big question, I believe. You know, the reason we got interested in this is because when you follow, you know, anywhere from politicians to, you know, business advocates to policymakers, there's always a sense in which, you know, they seem to share this view that subsidizing small firms has positive economic effects. It plays an important role in economic growth, in job creation, and so forth. And you know, this historically has been something that we're seeing, you know, for the past at least I'd say 70 years or so, where governments around the world have actually devised policies that, you know, directly or indirectly subsidize small firms, provide preferential treatment to small firms. It started in the United States, you know, in the 1950s with the Small Business Act, followed by the establishment of the Small Business Administration. Europe was somewhat late to this game. They joined with a bunch of subsidies and reforms in the 1970s or so. And, you know, this seems to be a consensus view. So, you know, it crosses party lines. You know, you listen to Democrats, Republicans, you know, different political persuasions, as I said, media, policymakers, they all seem to share this view that you know, policies that target small firms are beneficial to society and the economy. You know, just to give you a couple examples here in the United States, this is going to be the focus of our paper. I know if you look at procurement contracts, these are contracts allocated by the US government. The US government, federal government, is the biggest customer in the world, as you probably know. They actually set aside something like 20% of their annual allocation of contracts specifically to small firms. You know, it's true for, you know, flagship programs that the SBA, the Small Business Administration, runs, like the 7A program that extends guaranteed loans to small businesses. And it's true across across the board, you know, when it comes to tax codes, items that prefer or that provide some subsidies to small firms. You know, oftentimes, if you look at regulations here in the United States, you'll actually see an asterisk that says that small firms below a certain threshold are exempt from, you know, complying. Obviously, we think about regulatory compliance as being costly. It's a large fixed cost often, and so we exclude small businesses from it, and so on and so forth. If you're still not convinced, unless you've lived on the moon in the last you know, few months, you've probably heard about the Payroll Protection Program, or the PPP, which is one of the flagship programs that's part of the CARES Act, passed you know, after the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. It closed, I believe, around August. It dispersed more than $500 billion. In guaranteed loans to small businesses. It actually specifically targeted small businesses and was run or overseen by the SBA. And you know, if you still don't buy into the argument that we somehow feel, you know, policymakers and so on, they all share this sentiment that we should aid small firms. Just look at what happened during the program when a bunch of large firms somehow slipped through the cracks and were able to obtain these loans through their lenders. There was a huge public outcry saying we shouldn't extend loans to large firms. This is only reserved to small firms. And many of those larger firms that obtained PPP loans were actually subsequently returned those loans. Now, you know, if you think about the economics of why these small firm subsidies actually exist, you know, I'd say that there's two sort of main, you know, intertwined motivations here, or two key ingredients. The first is that, you know, we believe or policy makers, politicians believe that small firms are important. Okay, so if you go to the SBA's website and you look at some of the publications originating in their Office of Advocacy, you'll immediately see that they talk about how small firms are important for the economy. In fact, on their front page, they'll highlight that small businesses employ more than 60 million people in the United States, roughly half of private sector workforce. And they actually sort of argue, hey, this leads to economic growth. It actually increased net jobs by 1.6 million in 2019. This is taken straight out of their 2020 report. There's also academic research suggesting that small firms are important for employment, what's called dynamism. I like to think about it as, the process of creative destruction, if you like, innovation and growth. Of course, in our paper, we're not going to get into that literature much, whether it's size or, the age of the firm. There's some mixed evidence there, but at the end of the day, I think there's research coming out suggesting that small, young firms are important for economic growth and innovation. And certainly employment. The other key that's, the other key ingredient that's got to be there if you think about subsidizing them is that there's got to be something wrong with the market, right? I mean, in some sense, we're sort of hanging our head on the fact that the market doesn't do a great job or does not optimally allocate resources to small firms, and hence the government needs to intervene. And again, to be honest, it's not entirely clear when you read what politicians or policymakers say. It's not entirely clear which type of friction they have in mind. Academic research obviously offered its share. Here in finance, we're mostly thinking about some sort of financial constraints that arise from credit rationing to small firms, given no collateral, high levels of information asymmetry, and so on and so forth. There's also stories about entrepreneurs not internalizing technological innovations or spillovers in such innovations, and so on and so forth. So again, these two key ingredients, the fact that we care about small firms, they're important for the economy, and the market, if left alone, is not going to optimally allocate resources to them, have sort of brought about this idea that we need to subsidize small firms. Okay, now, interestingly, when it comes to research, actually looking into the economic effects of small business subsidies, there isn't much. And I think, again, I don't want to do injustice to the few papers that are out there, but at the end of the day, clearly, the big challenge here is that providing or identifying causal effects of small business subsidies is hard, right? It's economically, it's just challenging. It's empirically challenging, given that those subsidies are clearly, or that government policies for that matter in general are non-random. Right, and so you can obviously tell stories where whatever economic indicators you're looking at, they're not necessarily the consequence, but rather can be the determinant of the policies or the subsidies that you're observing. Okay, now there are a few papers out there that actually have neat identification strategies, but they focus on developing economies. Okay, so mostly India, and I've referenced here on this slide a couple papers that came out recently in the AER that are sort of cool papers that make use of the passing of certain reforms in India to identify the role or the economic effects of subsidies. The problem is how do we generalize this to a country like the United States, right? So if you think about these papers in India that are looking at cases where the government sort of revoked or eliminated / cut some subsidies, they find that this actually had positive effects. But clearly, in a setting where, or in a country where the government plays a very different role, where there's corruption, agency, and very different market frictions compared to a developed country or economy like the United States, it's not clear that this actually generalizes. And I think this is, this is where our paper sort of comes in. We're going to offer a novel empirical approach that will allow us to identify, hopefully I'll convince you that it allows us to identify the effects of give you a taste, and obviously I'll walk you through the details in a few slides. We're going to look at changes in what's called size standards, or small business size standards. Okay, this is small business size standards are sort of overseen again by the SBA. Those standards, you can think about them as simply being the size threshold under which a business is eligible to be considered as a small business in the United States. And so clearly this determines eligibility for small business subsidies across a wide range of subsidies offered by federal subsidies offered here in the United States. And so that's one cool aspect of our paper. We're not going to focus on a specific subsidy. Instead, we're going to look at a host of different subsidies, all determined jointly, if you like, by these small business standards. And what's good for us is that these are defined very granularly at the 6-digit NICE industry level. And so, I'll talk about the identification strategy later, but you can immediately see how this creates variation, obviously at this point non-random, in access or eligibility to small business subsidies across firms, across industries here in the United States. Okay. And so just to give you a quick taste, we're going to specifically look at the period around the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010, because it came in and actually mandated that all industries need to be reviewed every 5 years and so on and so forth. I'll talk about the details. So this was a shock to the setting or the reviews of industries and their small business size standards here in the United States. And we're going to exploit random variation in the timing of these reviews, or in the timing of the implementation of the recommendation of these reviews. Okay, so what are the research questions? Well, we're going to try to answer 3 main questions. The first one, we're just going to see whether this has the changing of this landscape or the changing of these small business size standards across industries. Does that change what we observe, the composition of industries? In particular, does it hurt or benefit small firms vis-a-vis large firms? Of course, if the answer were no, we're seeing no effects, we would just stop there and move on to our next project. We're then going to look at what the economic implications are. And I think this is where the paper sort of makes its biggest contribution. We're going to try to see how this affects the sort of the stated goals of these subsidies, creative destruction, business dynamism, employment. We're going to try to see or to look at the effects within industries, regional effects, thinking about agglomeration economies. We're going to take a deep dive into job flows, earnings, employment. And then we're going to provide some more, sort of direct mechanisms, and specifically look at 2 of the key sort of subsidies where we have micro level data on each procurement contract and each small business loan, and see how those change in response to the policy changes that we're observing. Okay, so before I stop and take questions, let me just give you a quick preview of the results. We find that there's been a dramatic increase in small business size standards since the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010 was passed. Okay, and in itself, I think this is an interesting sort of development that we're observing, where larger firms in the United States across the board are now qualifying for small business subsidies. This has important compositional effects. In fact, it crowds out small firms, and I'll show you the evidence. It actually has negative economic effects. We're finding persistent job losses after such size standards increase. We're finding declines in earnings. We're finding negative effects or increases, if you like, in unemployment, regional unemployment as a consequence of these changes. And we're finding that they're actually accompanied by what you would expect to see in the domain of both federal contracts that are now flowing to larger firms, and guaranteed credit that the SBA provides through its programs to small businesses. All right, let me stop here, and I'm very happy to answer any question.
Ron, so one question I have is, to what extent the size is manipulation proof here? Can the companies manipulate their size in response to the change in the requirements by the government? Is it, when there's a cut-off on the size being measured, and when is the program implemented?
Yeah, I think this is a good question, and obviously we've thought about this. keep in mind that we're not running analysis at the level of the individual firm. Okay, but if it were true, and if it were just all sort of firms manipulating their sizes, and by the way, it's not easy to do because many of these changes are quite dramatic. So, if you're at 20, I mean, I haven't talked about how these size standards are being defined, but if you're thinking about, a size standard being defined based on employees, and in an industry, it goes up from 100 employees to 200 or 300 employees, and I'll show you that the increases are quite dramatic. It's sort of hard to get away from, with it. It's not, these are not small changes, but at the margin, it could very well be that a company that employed 49 employees now, employs 2 more and qualifies as a small firm if the size standard increased. So this could very well be the case, but at some level, we're going to abstract away from that, right? We're going to ask very broad questions about overall economic effects. And so if there's manipulation at the margin, sure, but our identification strategy isn't based off of it. Everything we do is at the industry level, and most of our outcome variables, or I'd say the vast majority of them, are not going to be at the level of the individual firm.
All right, thank you. Let's move on.
Okay. So let me sort of dig a little bit deeper into the details. So as I said, those size standards that are set by the SBA, the Small Business Administration, or in particular the Office of Size Standards within the SBA, determine whether or not a business qualifies as a small business. It determines its eligibility for small business subsidies. There's two different ways to categorize firms or to determine those size standards. One is based on their annual revenues, the idea being that you set a cutoff, say $50 million, and all companies with annual revenues, receipts below $50 million, qualify as small firms. Alternatively, it can be decided based on the number of employees, and this distinction has been, sort of there for a long time. This is not a choice variable in our setting. For many, many years, way before the Jobs Act of 2010, industries were basically divided into those where standards are based off of annual revenues and those where standards are based off of the number of employees. And what's nice for us is that those are defined at the industry, at the 6-digit NAICS level industry. So each 6-digit NAICS industry has its own size standard. So for one industry, plastic products, small firms are those with fewer than 100 employees. And for another industry, say defense, the size standard can, small firms can be those with fewer than 1,000 employees. And you'll see that there are industries where that threshold is nowhere where you would think that it should be, or at least ex ante. I was surprised to see that many industries have thresholds well above what I would sort of think intuitively would be a small, would define a small firm. Okay, and now, just to, I've already talked about this, but just to give you some concrete numbers, we're talking about meaningful policies and subsidies here. Okay, so if you qualify as a small firm, you get access for procurement contracts reserved just for small firms. We're talking about a goal set by Congress of 23% of contracts flowing to small businesses. And what's nice for us, and I'll show you that later, is that we can actually identify those contracts at the contract level. We know which ones are contracts that in the database were part of that quota of 23%. It's also interesting that, the different procuring agencies in the US federal government actually met this goal quite closely. In our sample period, the fraction that of contracts allocated to small firms is above 20%, steady state. You know, guaranteed loans are another big one. You've got to be a small firm to qualify for a guaranteed loan, such as this SBA 7A program. This is their flagship program. Just in 2019, fiscal year 2019, they allocated more than $23 billion in loans. Okay. And so, you know, again, these are quite substantial numbers. And again, there's various other federal programs that I'm not gonna get into. Let me see here, sorry. The Small Business Jobs Act of 2010 is really sort of an interesting sort of point in time, and I'll show you that graphically later, where, you know, Congress actually passed an act that said, you know, we've got to go in and we've got to start reviewing our size standards, and in particular, you know, the key sort of ingredient for us is that they actually mandated the review of, you know, a third of all 6-digit Nike's industries every 18 months, and a full circle, sort of going through all industries, reviewing all industries every 5 years. It's sort of cool because it's not driven by any sort of industry specific, if you like, you know, economic development, given that the schedule was preset. Okay, so it's not that, you know, something happens in an industry in 2013 and hence, you know, we go in and we increase. You can only be, you know, the size standard in an industry can only be changed during its mandated review time window, and that's preset. Okay, and we've talked to program administrators at the SBA. We've gone through all of their documents, and we've sort of verified that this is indeed the case. You know, you could ask me, and you know, sorry if I stole anyone's question here. What, you know, why do we see this this act in 2010 mandating those reviews? Why are we all of a sudden seeing increases? And here, you know, my guess is as good as yours, but it seems to me that this is part of a general trend where, you know, larger firms are often, you know, and more often today than before, are lobbying for such changes. And so I think the accumulation of, you know, lobbying efforts and pressure from the corporate sector has actually sort of pushed Congress to pass this act that says, hey, you've got to go in and start reviewing these industries. I don't think though that this is driven by any sort of economic trend that was sort of across the board, and I'll show you obviously evidence confirming that. Yes.
Here's a question which has probably partially been addressed already, but I guess there's some, you know, still remains. So why can these firms stand on their own? How does the SBA decide which businesses industries to support, and what is the measure of success?
All right, I'm not sure I got the question. So, you know, there could obviously clearly be other policies outside the scope of what we're studying here that target a specific individual firm. But, you know, the size standard framework provides this umbrella sort of framework that factors into all the sort of large ticket items that were put in place to subsidize small firms. And so there's clearly competition over those resources, and, you know, it's played by the book. In other words, if you're trying to qualify for an SBA loan, or if you're trying to qualify for a small business procurement contract, it's got to be the case that you're eligible, that you comply with that size standard. But again, I'm not sure that I fully addressed the question. So tell me if I haven't.
Okay, so we have a different question now, so maybe we get clarification on the first one. So are VC-backed firms eligible for the various programs?
Are VC-backed firms? That's a good question. I believe that the answer is yes. So any small business enterprise that satisfies these requirements qualifies to be eligible for. Now, this doesn't guarantee that you get it, right? I mean, the SBA, you know, it's not that procurement contracts are automatically awarded to any small firm. Sometimes there's still competition among small firms, and and there's a firm that wins and a bunch of bidders that lose. But every sort of ongoing enterprise, doesn't matter how it's financed, that qualifies, or that's below that threshold, qualifies, with again some differences across programs. So for example, and I'll talk about this, the SBA 7A loan program actually says, hey, it's not enough to be a small firm. It's also got to be the case that the credit elsewhere sort of provision applies. In other words, that you can get financing elsewhere. If you're a public company, albeit small, you've got fewer than 8,000 employees in an industry where the threshold is 1,000 employees, you won't necessarily get an SBA loan, since you have access to capital. But again, based on size standards, you're at least eligible to be considered, and then the decision itself obviously varies.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Here's the neat part. Here's the cool part, and this is of course where I'd be happy if you guys pushed back and complained, because it'll tell me that we still have to work on this. But here's the main sort of innovation in the paper. The idea is that we recognize that the decision to increase a size standard in an industry, the decision itself could be endogenous or is endogenous and could be correlated with some economic trends, the very economic trends that we're later trying to study in our paper. And so we're not going to identify off of the fact that the industry gets an increase and the other does not. In fact, we're going to restrict our attention only to industries where a size increase actually happens as a consequence of or around the Small Business Jobs Act of 2010. The idea, though, is that the timing in which those industries are reviewed is random. And what do I mean by random? There's talking to program administrators, going through the details, it's clear that there's various dimensions on which this was arbitrary. For example, for administrative ease, the SBA actually reviewed 2-digit sectors and all the 6-digit industries clustered or that belong to that 2-digit sector at the same time. Okay, so that means that even if something you could argue triggered or should have triggered a review in a 6-digit industry, the fact that there is 300 other industries within that 2-digit sector that were sort of reviewed at the same time is purely for administrative ease, and this has been confirmed by people at the SBA. Okay, the other sort of interesting feature is that, again, arbitrarily, the SBA implemented the Jobs Act by first sort of looking at all revenue-based standards and only then moved to employee-based standards. Again, this has nothing to do with economic factors. Now, the decision itself, okay, at the time that it was reviewed and decided, that could still be sort of correlated by economic factors, but we're going to get all of our identification from variation or random variation in the timing of the reviews. Okay, and here's sort of the empirical setting that we have in mind. So we're only going to look at industries where this happened. Okay, so again, we're sort of holding constant the decision to increase a size standard in an industry, and we're only going to look at, for us, treatment is only going to be the effect or the variation across industry A that gets treated in 2012, say, and industry B that gets treated in 2014. Okay, so this is where we're going to identify the effects off of this variation or random variation in the timing. Okay, and so this is a condensed slide. It's got a bunch of different things, but importantly, let me start with the table and then talk about some of the other stuff here. Importantly, what you see here is that if you look at the likelihood of a size standard change, and there's virtually no decreases in size standards, they're only increasing, that likelihood does not depend on the timing. Okay, so the 3 dates that you have here, the 3 date variables that you have here, announced, proposed, and finalized, those are all sort of ordering of sectors from 1 to n based on the order in which they were considered. And you can see that the likelihood of actually being treated in the sense that a size standard increases has nothing to do, is uncorrelated with the announcement of the review, with the proposal of of whether or not we should increase, and with the date in which the decision was finalized. All of these are moot, meaning that the order itself in no way correlates with the decision to increase the size standard. So in other words, if you had in mind a story where maybe the SBA front loads all those industries where a size standard increase, say, is overdue or is due to some economic rationale, we're not seeing this in the data. And vice versa, if you think they're lazy, they're trying to do the easy ones first, we're not seeing that either. So there's nothing here to suggest that there's any correlation between the timing and between the likelihood of a size standard increase. Now, the other thing that sort of, that I want to show you here is that, or that's important on this slide, is that, there's a lot of changes during our sample period. So it was sort of done ad hoc before. If you go back to the early 2000s, there were some instances here and there, but there was no sort of systematic review and such a large sort of increase in size standards. We're actually seeing 595 size standard increases in our sample period. In fact, about 57, 58% of the industries that are being reviewed are seeing some sort of a size increase. And so, this tells you two things. A, this is a broad-based sort of phenomenon. This is not, a couple industries that we're talking about here. This is a big chunk of the overall US economy, but there's still enough variation, right? So there's variation in the timing, and there's clearly a bunch of industries where there's been no increase at all, which are not part of our study, but are sort of interesting to perhaps study independently. Okay, as I said, we haven't seen any decreases in size standards over the sample period. And again, if you're wondering why, it's quite simple. I don't think that the SBA wanted to go back, to tell firms, by the way, your entire, business model or your reliance on subsidies, we're taking this away. And so it only worked in one direction, where sort of larger firms were brought into the pool.
Ran, to what extent can lobbyists affect the timing or the process in general, and in particular, whether the industry will receive the increase in size or not?
I think that's a good question. Again, we're going to identify off of variations such as, the fact that we're first seeing revenue-based standards being handled and only then employee. This has nothing to do with lobbying. We're going to take advantage of the administrative ease of, sort of looking at entire sectors all at once. But when it comes to lobbying per se, I mean, lobbying could have affected the passing of the act, and it's not impossible to think that lobbying somehow also sort of trickled into certain industries being sort of reviewed before others. Again, in the grand scheme of things, our identification strategy sort of moves beyond that, in the sense that we're taking advantage of the very sort of unique aspects of this review that I highlighted before. But again, I don't have a lot of visibility into lobbying. I mean, per se, we've collected data on lobbying. We can certainly correlate lobbying with increases sort of at the aggregate level, but the timing itself seems to be predetermined in 2010 and has all these quirks in it that suggest that it was random in that sense. The other thing that I'll say, the SBA administrators did not tell us that lobbying affected their decisions. Okay, so we didn't get any indication there.
All right, thank you.
All right, so here it is on a figure. You can see sort of that there's a lot of action taking place around the 2010 Act. On the left sort of y-axis, you see revenue size standards increasing from about I don't know, below 10 million to an average of close to 20 million across industries. Employee-based, you're seeing that it's increasing from roughly 500 to over 750 on average. So again, these are quite substantial increases that we're seeing, even just on average during our sample period. So, let me talk about the data. So clearly, this was a sort of a massive data collection effort that brings together many different sort of pieces. Size standards themselves, or changes in size standards, those were all hand collected from the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, and obviously that's what I've just shown you on the previous slide. In the analysis of industry composition, we're going to focus on whether there's been a shift or a change in the representation of small firms in both establishments and employees. So number of establishments and number of employees, again, within each 6-digit NAICS industry. And so these data on establishments and employees by the size of firms is taken from the census, okay, the SUSB. We have, we've used very cool data from census again on job flows and earnings. This is the LEHD data set for those of you that have worked with it before. This gives you data on job flows, and this is going to be important for us because I'm gonna want to say something not just about switching between industries, but I also want to say something more sort of robust about aggregate employment, if you like, job-to-job flows, job losses, and so on, and data on earnings as well. Again, this is all at the industry level. We also have, one thing that we were curious about was to try to study regional effects. And so in particular, I wanted to see whether, there's clearly areas or regions in the United States that are more or less reliant on small firms, that are more or less affected by the changing landscape of small business subsidies in the United States. And so we wanted to see whether, as a region, as an MSA, we're going to work with metropolitan statistical areas or MSAs, whether those were affected by the changes in, the small business size standards were picking up. And so we're collecting data on unemployment from the BLS, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then, at the micro level data, we've got two sets of data. One is procurement contracts. Matt, Dennis, and I have written a paper using this data set before. This is a cool contract level data set that identifies each contract procured by the government, including all subsequent renegotiations, modifications, and so on. And critically for us, it actually has this flag that says whether this is a small business contract or not. Okay, and this data, for those of you interested in working with it, it's just a matter of downloading the data and cleaning it up. It's available at usaspending.gov. And then lastly, we're going to provide some micro-level evidence on SBA loans as well. We're going to focus on the 7A sort of flagship lending program that they have, but we're going to also, we wanted to see, the problem with these data, unlike procurement contracts data, is that, the size of the firms, of the borrowers, isn't really accurate or sort of meaningful. And so, we couldn't actually do an analysis where we compare, firm size before and after an industry change or size standard change. And therefore, just for us, we sort of wanted to try to get some of these data and see whether these programs are actually flowing to small businesses. So we matched these data, the loan level data, with NETS. Those of you that have worked with NETS before know it's a very large data set that has information about small businesses in the United States.
Ron, here's a question about how this process of changes is being done. So, is there a comment period for the new rules to be implemented, or size changes are only up to the staff without outside input?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Again, so is there a comment period for this, or are size changes only up to the staff without outside input?
Oh, comments. Yeah. Okay. Good question. Yes. So, there's a whole process, and that process is one where the SBA makes its recommendations, and the House Subcommittee on Small Businesses actually collects comments. It actually, the SBA collects comments. The House Subcommittee collects comments. They actually often also hold public hearings. It's an interesting process where, if you follow this very closely over time, and certainly since the enactment of the Jobs Act, we've seen that large firms are constantly commenting, lobbying, and being vocal in the need to increase size standards because they want a piece of the pie, whereas small firms are often sort of complaining, saying that this is going to kill them, this is going to kill competition. And interestingly, the media, certainly, articles that we've seen in popular media outlets, Washington Post, New York Times, and so on, they typically side with the small businesses complaining that there's these subsidies that are taken away from them. But there's clearly a whole process where, as a business owner, you get to voice your opinion, make a comment, and that's certainly part of the process.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so before I start showing you results, let me sort of talk, or sort of recap the empirical design, and then show you the the specification we're going to utilize. And so the idea, again, as I said, is that we're going to pick up randomness in timing, not the decision itself, not the fact that that this could be driven by either economic trends or even lobbying correlated with economic trends, if you like. This is going to be an identification strategy based solely on sort of the randomness in timing due to administrative ease and the fact that they just decided they're going to start with one batch and then do the other. The group of industries we're going to look at are only those that eventually experienced an increase in size standards. Again, we want to hold that decision constant and exploit just randomness or variation in the timing. And so the treatment effect at the end is just going to be identified off of that variation. Okay. So if you think about the simplest way to execute this, we're talking about a difference in differences specification here, where the key variable of interest is the size increase dummy. Okay, this is going to make the interpretation of the coefficients, the regression coefficients, quite simple. Okay, we're going to throw in industry fixed effects. We're going to throw in year fixed effects, obviously controlling for any sort of time invariant differences, unobservable differences across industries, or sort of macroeconomic time trends. If you're thinking that there's an overall shift in the U.S. economy, this is going to be absorbed by the fixed effects. And importantly, the dummy, the indicator variable size increase, is going to turn on once an industry J sort of gets treated or experiences a size increase. And again, standard errors were clustered at the industry level. Okay, so here's the first result that we have in the paper, and this result is really sort of the first sort of, for us, this was why we got interested. It's because we actually noticed that if you identify just off of the random timing of these increases, once a size standard increases in an industry, it actually dilutes, it actually lowers the representation of small businesses in that industry, okay? And so if you look at columns 1 and 2, with and without year fixed effects, you can see that the ratio of small business establishments to total establishments in an industry actually goes down. And the same is true in columns 3 and 4, same specification, if you look at employment ratio. So the overall sort of share of employment in small businesses compared to the number of employees in that industry. Now, a previous question that Andre brought up was, hey, what about manipulation? Aren't you worried about firms that are going to sort of game this or manipulate their size? Well, see, here's where the identification sort of abstracts away from this. We're actually going to uniformly only look at the very left tail of the distribution. It actually became evident as we looked very closely at these at the numbers, that it's really the smallest firms that are being affected. Those are the ones that are being crowded out. So, it's not necessarily right around where the size standard bites. And so all of the analysis that I'm going to show you are going to fix the definition of small firms as firms that employ fewer than 20 employees, okay? And so, larger firms, even if, and I'll show you some evidence that perhaps subsidies are being taken away from them, we're not necessarily seeing that they disappear from the sample or that they're no longer with us. It's the very small firms that are most reliant on those subsidies, right? This is, I think, in most people's minds where subsidies matter the most. It's for those very small firms with no tangible collateral, no access to capital markets, mostly just an idea and a bunch of people working, if you're thinking about entrepreneurship, or the very small businesses out there that are affected. Okay, and so this is where we're actually seeing the effect having a bite. Those are the firms that are being crowded out once subsidies are being shared with larger firms. Okay, and so the share of small establishments, just to give you the sort of magnitudes relative to the sample mean, declines by about 2 to 3% relative to sample mean, and the share of small employment in an industry following those increases declines by roughly 3 to 6%, again, relative to the sample mean. So, we're not talking 50%, right? But these are definitely sizable magnitudes. And again, I don't want you to take this as the main result in the paper, because, this is just for us almost like, trying to test the water and see whether this has an effect. And we're indeed seeing this crowding out of small businesses. Now, let me mention one other thing. Hopefully not to detract us too much from what I want to show you, but if you actually think about sort of trying to quantify the overall effects, obviously you could tell a story where the government is actually benefiting from this, right? And so if the government is perhaps providing fewer subsidies, or if the government puts on its procurement hat and says, hey, now I have access to larger firms, manufacturing whatever it is that I'm trying to buy, perhaps at a cheaper price because they have economies of scale or what have you, then the government, there might be ways in which the government is benefiting from this, or even has an incentive to allow more firms to participate in the process. So, I don't want to oversell our findings or sort of argue that there is no trade-offs here. We all know that there are clearly trade-offs no matter, what we're studying. But it is the case that we're seeing this compositional shift in industries that are, being subjected to an increase in size standards, or where larger firms now come in and take a share of small business subsidies. And again, these effects, I want to emphasize, are only identified off of this random variation in the timing of the implementation of the size standard increase. Okay, so this is sort of the first result that we have in the paper. Again, we're all sort of mindful about concerns about the validity of a difference in difference, where obviously there is a parallel trends assumption that we can't directly observe or test, but we could at least provide some evidence on. And so here's one piece of evidence. We're looking at the dynamics here, where we're going to see whether we're observing some pre-trend in the representation of small businesses in an industry in terms of establishments or employment. And you can see that we're not picking up any pre-trend prior to the increase in size standards, right? So across both columns that look at either establishments or employment, there's nothing really before the size increase is being implemented. So the first time it has a bite is in the year after the implementation of the size standard increase, and you're seeing that there is robust negative effects throughout sort of the post size standard change period. Okay. Questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Thank you.
Alrighty. So here's, to me, this is the most interesting part, and this is where our paper actually deviates from, the two AER papers that I mentioned that look at India. They actually find that removing small business subsidies, removing preferential treatment helps. And again, I think it's a very different setting where you can immediately tell stories about, corruption and the likes, free enterprise and so on. Here in the United States, it's obviously a very different story. The frictions are different. We want to believe that the level of corruption is very different. And so, we want to ask the question of what the economic consequences are, the idea being that we've seen that, there's crowding out of small firms. Okay. Some of you might say, this is not too surprising. I mean, you take away subsidies from small firms, some of them die. Maybe those are the firms that needed dying anyway. And so I think the big sort of question is what the overall economic effects are. And again, as I said, we're going to have two units of analysis here. One is within an industry and the other is across regions. Now here, I don't think that, for this audience, there's any need to go into the sort of economic theories underlying both sort of possibilities. It remains an empirical question where on the one hand, you have, sort of neoclassical, economists, John Kenneth Galbraith, even Adam Smith, right, sort of arguing for the benefits of economies of scale and even monopoly power for that matter. And so, I mean, there's industries that are organized around a few large firms, and if you give them access to more subsidies, it's not necessarily a bad thing, or it's not necessarily detrimental to the industry. Whereas, there's clearly the alternative view of, Schumacher, right, that sort of coined the term "small is beautiful." I mean, we sort of, he sort of says, small firms play a distinct role specifically in technological changes and innovations. There's some evidence that this is indeed the case, and so they're crucial for the process of business dynamism or creative destruction, and consequently, they're sort of important vehicles for economic growth, employment growth, and so on and so forth. And so this is really where you could actually sort of envision both effects taking place, or perhaps they cancel each other out, in which case we will find no effects. Okay. And so, let's first look at business dynamism. And I've got to admit that, I'm not super excited, super happy about, the way business dynamism is measured in the literature. This is not to say that I necessarily have a better way of measuring it, but, this is trying to come close to measuring some, process of creative destruction. And so the idea is that, we're running these regressions where the dependent variable, the left-hand side variable, dynamism, is defined as, births and expansions of establishments scaled by contractions and deaths. Okay, so a higher sort of dynamism ratio implies, that firms, we're seeing more birth and expansions of existing of new firms or existing firms, and we're seeing fewer contractions or deaths of firms. This, for these data or for these variables, we actually can't observe them at the 6-digit level, and so we've got to aggregate to a 4-digit NAICS. And so what we have on the right-hand side is a variation of the indicator I talked about before, the size increase indicator, which is the proportion of 6-digit industries within a 4-digit NAICS industry that are seeing a size standard increase. This is just an unfortunate glitch in the data, if you like, where we just don't observe these these granular data on deaths, expansions, births, and so on at the 6-digit level. But what you can see across the board, right, and again here, this is just two regressions out of more that we have in the paper, is that we're finding negative effects. In other words, once you sort of crowd out small firms, overall business dynamism, right? Overall births and expansions scaled by contractions and debts are actually going down. And it's true for just small firms if you look at column 2, but it's true in general. Okay, and I think it's the general part that interests us the most. It's not just about small firms. This has overall implications for the industry. The magnitudes are quite significant. So a standard deviation increase in the proportion of industries undergoing this size standard increase, sort of is correlated with about a 4 to 5% decrease in dynamism. Okay, and so one interpretation here is that this reallocation, if you like, of small businesses from smaller firms to larger firms crowds out small firms, and consequently we're seeing dynamism going down. And again, I don't want to hang my head too much on this particular sort of interpretation, because you can tell other stories about sort of economic rationale for births and expansions vis-a-vis deaths and contractions that are not necessarily inefficient. But again, this is a standard measure in the literature for dynamism.
Yeah, Ran, were you able to test the effect of lender types? Anecdotally, firms with better relationship with or access to lenders were able to snap up PPP loans quicker. In your case, you're doing the industry analysis, but you can probably still do some kind of variation in industry level access to external financing.
It's an interesting point. We haven't thought about it. Um, I guess an interesting sort of question here is whether relationship lending somehow undoes the binding effects of perhaps size standards. That's a good question. Now, I would love to test it. And definitely I'm making a mental note. I just want to mention one caveat, which is that, as I said, the loan level data that we have from the SBA, which, by the way, we had to FOIA, User Freedom of Information Act sort of request, but I think subsequently they actually put it on the website. So those of you who want to work with it, I think it's now readily available to use. But they don't identify small businesses well, and so it's hard to tell which firms are compliant or non-compliant with small business size standards. So for that you'll need some sort of like a nets data or something else, and even there it's not entirely clear. I'll show you that it's mostly the very small firms that are relying on SBA loans. But again, I like this. It's an interesting point. We haven't looked at relationship lending at all. Which is one potential way. I don't know. You can take the view of either this being value enhancing through mitigating information asymmetries, or conversely, this could be evidence of some sort of favoritism. But either way, I think this is an interesting question. Other questions?
Very good. Very good.
Okay. Let me see. All right. So just to summarize, we've seen the crowding out of small firms, and we're actually seeing that, for what it's worth, and again, this is the set of results that I'm, less confident about. We're seeing declines in business dynamism. The next set of results, I think, are the most convincing and interesting to me, certainly because, these are the results that are looking at labor, at employment, and income. And I think this is really what politicians and the SBA care about the most. It's featured on their front pages. It's in every discussion. This thought that we need to subsidize small firms to support employment. Okay, and so unlike the India papers that show that if you remove subsidies, you'll actually see an increase in employment, we're finding the opposite effects. And so, in columns 1 and 2 here, what you're seeing is as a dependent variable, again, same specification as before, once again at the 4-digit level, which means that we need to aggregate across all 6 digits within a 4-digit. We're seeing that there's an increase in aggregate job losses following a size standard increase. And so, job losses actually increase. And what's really fascinating here is that this is not some sort of a reallocation of labor where small businesses or small business owners or entrepreneurs somehow just recast themselves, move to different industries, or find another job. These are mostly permanent stable losses. Okay, and so this is a very cool variable that one could look at in the data set, and we're actually finding strong support that these are permanent. Well, nothing is permanent in life, but these are sort of permanent from their definition. Based on their definition, these are permanent job losses, meaning we're talking about long periods of unemployment following this crowding out of small firms. Okay, and again, the magnitudes are quite substantial. So in a standard deviation increase, in size standards actually correlates with a 0.1 to 0.14 standard deviation increase in job losses. So quite substantial. And we're also seeing declines in earnings. Okay, which again, they're not necessarily very different from job losses in some sense, but earnings go down, both current, so earnings of current employees and the earnings of new employees, they all drop, arguably because of reduced competition in labor market. We're seeing declines that are quite substantial, not only in employment but also in earnings in industries that sort of where this crowding out takes place. Okay. So everything I've shown you so far was done at the industry level. Okay, so at the industry level, we find those detrimental effects on dynamism and on employment, but we really wanted to see how this sort of factors into agglomeration economies. In other words, what happens when you look at regions across the United States that rely more or less on small businesses and hence on these small business subsidies. And so there's a lot of there's a nice emerging convincing industry literature, that talks about the synergistic benefits of co-location of firms, and in particular, right, they're thinking about those spillover effects across firms that co-locate, that are located one next to each other, in terms of productivity, investment, and so forth. Right, these are recent clever papers that we've seen come out, sort of talk about the economic rationale of co-location. And we want to sort of take it a step further in our setting and see whether agglomeration economies also benefit from small business subsidies, right? The idea being that if you've got a region with a bunch of small businesses, they're being subsidized. Those subsidies, or capital infusions, if you like, then support employment and businesses in the region. Yet another type of spillover within regions. Okay, and so we've done this in the following way, and let me jump straight to the results. We've said, well, let's look at, or let's differentiate between MSAs, between metropolitan statistical areas, based on their exposure to these increases in size standards. Okay, and so we're just going to take the normalized share of small firms that are seeing a size standard increase in each region, right? So some regions have more or less small businesses operating in industries where the size standards are either increasing now or will increase in the future. Remember, it's the same identification strategy that identifies the effects of variation, random variation in the timing. Okay, and what we're seeing here is that, again, here the data that we have is different. We can look at unemployment rates, but what we're seeing is that overall regional unemployment rates increase once you pull out those subsidies. Okay, and in particular, unemployment increases by about 1.2 percentage points for every standard deviation increase in the exposure of an MSA to size standard increases. So again, quite substantial effects, not only at the industry level, but also at the regional level. Okay, and these regressions have the usual sort of controls that you can think about, right? MSA level population, right? Another economic indicator, house prices, GDP growth, and so on and so forth. Okay, so again, before I move into the next set of results, I just want to sort of highlight again, that I think our paper, I actually wasn't ex ante necessarily expecting to find what we're finding, but our paper actually shows that at least for the outcome variables that policymakers think about, right? They're correct in sort of believing in their perception that small business subsidies actually support employment and actually support employment growth, and at some level, take it for what it's worth, creative destruction, this process through which we're seeing economic growth through the business cycle. Okay, so this is sort of the two first research questions that we had in mind, but we also thought that I mean it's I think one benefit of utilizing this sort of large scale data and working at the industry level and so on is that you get meaningful aggregate numbers. And again, I think these are the numbers that policymakers care about and perhaps should care about. But as economists, of course, we always want to sort of dig deeper and look at micro level evidence to see whether what we think is going on is actually going on, and so get some external validation for the mechanisms we have in mind, and also just in general learn more about the different subsidies and programs. And the choice of the two that I'm going to talk about here, procurement and SBA loans, is mostly just driven by availability of data. These are the two programs for which, after non-trivial efforts, we could actually obtain micro level, loan level, or contract level data on those those allocations and see whether those allocations themselves exhibit any changes around these policy changes that we're seeing here in the United States. Okay, and so if you like, broadly speaking, I like to think about procurement as being the demand side and loan being the credit supply side. Okay, and so we're going to try to see some evidence on both. Okay, and so how does this universe of eligible firms change over time? Well, when it comes to procurement, as I said, in our sample, more than 20% during our sample period is actually set aside to small firms, and we get to observe each and every contract that's allocated to a small firm. Now, interestingly, once you sort of have these revisions in size standards, these increase in size standards come in, more and more or larger and larger companies can come in and qualify for those contracts. These are oftentimes very profitable, sort of make it or break it type contracts, and the government might actually be happy about this if it puts on its procurement hat, given that it now has access to a wider range of suppliers. It's allowed to go and procure from larger contractors. Okay, but on the other hand, the question, of course, is what happens to small firms. And so what's nice here, differently from everything we've done before, and hence perhaps a bit more open to criticisms about manipulation, but still worthwhile looking at, is the question of do we see changes in subsidies, right? So I've told you that the small business size standards are changing the eligibility criteria, but does it actually show up in procurement contracts? And I'll show you some evidence on that by comparing between those firms that were small always and those new firms that are now all of a sudden becoming eligible for small business contracts or born before the size standard increased. Okay, so that's going to be the first piece of analysis. The other is going to look at guaranteed credit, and here, interestingly, there's a different effect. And so we were at first sort of rubbing our eyes and sort of puzzled by the results, but here, first, we can't actually observe the size of each borrower very, very accurately. So we've got to go and sort of match it with other data, which becomes noisy and so on. But the other interesting feature is that, size standards themselves aren't enough. Okay, so over time, you realize that even if you're a small firm that qualifies under, based on a size standard, you might actually still not qualify for loans as a large firm because the credit elsewhere provision or rule does not apply to you. In other words, you're still a large enough company or a public company or a company that's not constrained or has access to capital, such that you don't qualify, right? Because these loans are reserved only for small firms that have nowhere else to go. They don't have any tangible assets. They don't have any collateral, and hence they have to rely on those loans to get credit. Okay, and so if you really think about what you'd expect when we're seeing crowding out of small firms, we're actually expecting to see a decline in overall credit extended to small firms, right? And so we're actually going to see exactly that. We're going to see that the SBA sort of loan program is actually extending less credit to industries where there's a size increase, because small firms are crowded out, and those that remain don't qualify for those loans. Okay. So here's the first set of results when it comes to procurement contracts. Again, here, this is the cleanest evidence we have on the compositional shift on this axis that's now given to larger firms. If you look at the first column to the left, the percent of contracts to always small firms, those are firms that were small firms to begin with, even under the lower size standard. Once the size standard increases, they actually get fewer contracts. And this is all scaled, right? So this is the percent of contracts that they get awarded following the size increase, the size standard increase. And you see that it's dropping by 5.6 percentage points, so a large decline. On the other hand, exactly what you would expect happens with newly small firms. What are newly small firms? These are actually larger firms that are now qualifying for small business subsidies or for those small business contracts. We're actually seeing an increase of 1.4 percentage points in contracts awarded to those larger firms. And so, this tells the whole story at a very micro level data. You take away small business subsidies or you increase the pool of firms, it's a zero-sum game. 20% goes to firms every year, so the pie stays the same. What happens consequently is that fewer smaller firms are getting those subsidies. Larger firms, newly classified as small, get those subsidies now. And as a result, and this goes back to the very beginning of my presentation, you're seeing the crowding out of small firms. So this is very sort of robust micro-level evidence that indeed this is the trend, or this is the effects that we're seeing that are taking place in the data. When it comes to guaranteed credit or to SBA loans, what we're actually seeing is an overall reduction in credit. And whether you look at the number of loans or loan amounts, aggregate amounts, you see a decline. And again, why? Because small firms are being crowded out. The newly classified small firms don't really qualify to be to obtain these loans, because they can get credit elsewhere. And so the number of loans declines by more than 10%. Total guaranteed credit drops by something like 17%. And again, this is all coming from the crowding out of small firms. Okay. Now, we actually looked at this carefully in the data. It's true that it's only the very small firms that are obtaining loans through the SBA loan programs. In fact, the median and average number of employees is around 4 and 7 or 9. I forget the exact numbers, but these are very, very small firms. Larger firms typically just don't qualify. Okay. Questions?
I guess let's just continue till the end, and then we'll probably take the main questions there, because we're about to hit the time.
I'm done. So I'm just going to conclude, and then happy to stay and chat. This paper, at the outset, even if you're you're skeptical about identification and causal inference, which you should be. One thing that's clearly happening in the data is that there's been a dramatic expansion in the set of firms that are eligible for small business subsidies in the United States over the past 10 years. It's been a very dramatic change. It's gone a little bit unnoticed, certainly in academic research, but this is a large phenomenon. And this is something that, the numbers are quite significant. As I said, about 595 industries that are seeing these increases. And you've seen the sheer sort of magnitude as well. We're talking about millions of dollars in revenues on average and hundreds of employees. And so, those thresholds have become wider and wider. Now going back to causal inference. So, we believe that we have a good instrument. Again, not the decision itself, increase size standards, rather just variation in timing. And through that instrument, we're picking up interesting results. First, perhaps the most expected result is that we're actually seeing the crowding out of small firms, but this has negative economic consequences. In particular, we're seeing declines in employment growth, in earnings, in business dynamism, in industries where this is happening. We're seeing amplified effects in regions, reliant on small firms. So this does spill over across agglomeration economies, and it's definitely showing up in federal programs such as government contracts, procurement, small business loans, SBA guaranteed loans, and so on. Okay, and so these findings are in sharp contrast to what we're finding in what researchers have found in India, but I believe that it's a very different setting, which tells you that we should be somewhat skeptical about extrapolating from one market structure to another, from one economy to another. But we really do have clean evidence, I believe, that these subsidies play an important role, certainly in employment here in the United States, much like the popular or the common wisdom and perception of policymakers, business advocates, the media, and so on and so forth. Okay, so thank you very much. With that, I'll conclude. But as I said, happy to stay behind and chat.
Ron, here's a question. So what we have here in your setting, that the size standard increases, so we have a larger number of firms competing for the same pool of subsidies. So if we were to make a, let's say, back of the envelope calculation, how much more subsidies to small businesses should increase to make this neutral effect on the employment, on the growth, on the access to capital, generally speaking? Because you do have more firms competing for the same pool of assets.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. I wish I could give you that number. The problem with giving you that number is that obviously there's all sorts of multipliers working in the data. It's very difficult for us. We thought long and hard about sort of backing out even just the marginal value of an additional dollar in sort of small business subsidy. But it's really hard, right? Because we don't know. I mean, we don't observe the full universe of say contractors. We don't know how many of them are being denied. We have some evidence, right? We can say that there's a 6% decline in the amount of contracts that these always small firms are getting, but that doesn't necessarily translate right away to 6% more in subsidies, and that will sort of solve the problem. I mean, you can take away such a number if you like, but I wouldn't sign on it because it's really hard, right? But for what it's worth, it could be that we're not talking about that much more money. The question is, how do we safeguard the process against say lobbying efforts from larger, more connected, wealthier firms that are trying to capture some of that process. And I think this is something that the U.S. economy has to sort of, our system has to cope with and figure out a way to work around.
Okay, here's another question. So what are the overall welfare implications of your findings?
That's hard to tell, right? Because as I said before, there's a trade-off, right? On the one hand, we're seeing lower employment. We're seeing fewer firms, small firms. We're seeing lower dynamism. On the other hand, we're also seeing that, at least when it comes to loans, and I don't have access or visibility into other programs, the government also, is spending less on subsidies. Perhaps through its procurement, it's getting better deals. Okay, and so, the idea that this is a clear case where you can. I think it's safe to focus on employment here and say, the overall implications are we are seeing a decline in employment, but the overall welfare implications are super complicated to measure. If for no other reason, I have no way of assessing the impact on the government side. And so that's really hard. It's an excellent question, but it's really hard for me to get at that.
Okay, and the last question for today would be, so this is the effect of the federal program changing standards for support of small business. Do we have any evidence that at least some of this is being undone at the more regional level, at the state level, municipality level, to provide support to the small firms which have been cut out from the government, the federal government subsidies?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Something we've thought about. I don't have systematic evidence, but I'll give you 2 pointers, and then if someone wants to sort of look at this, I think this would be a fantastic sort of research topic. So here are the 2 pointers that I want to mention. One, states often use the same standards. These are standards that presumably rely on the SBA. So it's already certified by a federal agency, and hence when governments, local governments, states are looking to provide small business subsidies, they often rely on these impartial sort of nationwide criteria, often, not always. And so one would have to disentangle between programs that have other criteria or that perhaps were even invoked to try to undo some of these effects vis-a-vis those that rely on the very same standards. The other pointer, and again, this is just for what it's worth, clearly at the grand scheme of things, the ability of individual or local governments or states to influence the economy is dwarfed by the federal government. Okay, so we're talking about this. This is order of magnitude. But this is not to say that this wouldn't be a fantastic sort of paper to write that looks at the effects and perhaps even the responses of local governments, states, cities, and so on.
All right, Ran, thank you very, very much. Again, let me thank Ran from everyone who joined in here today for the seminar. Appreciate you presenting your insightful paper. Please don't forget to join us next week, December 1st. We're going to have Jordan Nickerson from MIT. But for today, again, thank you very much for logging in, and see you next week.